step. What can figure it out? That's how it chooses you.
Claire.
Teresa.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very, very well indeed. As we have discussed briefly in person, I'm playing a lot of Assassin's Creed Odyssey again these days, which is thrilling. Thrilling. It's so good.
It's such a good video game.
It's so beautiful. I mean, like, Macedonia sucks. There's nothing fucking up there. And there's no way to get places other than ride a horse or run. But it's so beautiful that I don't hate having to ride and run all the way. Like, it doesn't bother me that there's no fast travel location for miles and miles and miles.
I know. Hearing you talk about it makes me want to play again. I had watched Felicia Day play World War Z, which is an online co-op game with friends, and much like the film, and I do believe the book, which I have not read, it's just masses of zombies coming at you, which is my ultimate nightmare, but also my ultimate thrill in video game world. And I wanted to get it and play with Tim, my partner, but you can't play local co-op. You have to only play online co-op, and everyone online says that it's almost impossible to play alone. Because I think they just give you NPCs that are quote-unquote helping you. I don't think they're very effective. So I'm not going to get it. And I'm bummed. And the reason why I can't get it is because I don't have any online friends.
Yeah.
Just kind of stupid. Like, maybe I should go get some online friends and play.
I mean, I don't understand that whole online co-op thing. Unless it's people you know who live elsewhere, and then it's fun.
Right. I have trouble trusting strangers.
And certainly trusting them when you're facing your greatest fear in video game form, right?
Exactly. I just cannot put my fate in the hands of complete and total strangers.
I need you guys to be ride or die, because this is very emotionally challenging for me.
Exactly.
Yeah. You can't trust some 18-year-old in Kansas to be on your team fighting zombies if you don't know them. How do I know how you are in a crisis, son?
That's right. Ugh, so, no World War Z for me, but I'll find something else, and I'm sure I'll share it with you all. You're welcome in advance.
Some episode ago, I was mentioning how long it has taken me to try and kill Medusa. I actually stopped trying. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go do other stuff. But as I've been playing, I'm like, ooh, I'm actually running out of other stuff to do. It's not like I don't have a ton of tiny quests, you know? But the big things, the big story-moving things now all involve killing a bunch of big bads. And so I'm going to have to get over it very soon, because the Minotaur, the Cyclops, and Medusa are not going to kill themselves. It doesn't matter how many little side quests I run for hunters who need me to kill sharks or whatever the hell. It's just a shame. Like, can't you just be dead? Can't you just be dead already?
I've waited long enough. Aren't you dead yet?
I'm not going to fight them. I'm just going to wait until they die. They're immortal beings? Oh, okay. The Minotaur died of old age, and I finally got to Atlantis. I love it so much. It makes me so happy. Oh, it's like the perfect end of a day. I have accomplished things. I have been responsible. I have met my dog's needs. I have met my school needs. I have met the podcast needs. I have met my personal needs. And now I'm going to kill some things. It's just wonderful.
It's, for me, such a satisfying way to relax, because it's not just watching something. You are participating. So it's at least a little more mentally active than it would be if you were just to watch the new season of Great British Baking Show, which just came out.
I know! I hoped you would mention it. I watched the episode yesterday. I was like, wait a minute. They're doing it episode by episode. You mean I have to wait until next week?
I know.
What?
Seth Meyers made this really great joke about it coming out a couple weeks ago, and he said, overworked therapists everywhere. Thank God.
Yeah.
I was a little bit stressed out last night. I had seen the episode, but Tim had not. So we watched it together, and it just instantly put me in a better mood. It's such a great collection of characters this time. Really talented bakers, and also just really fun people. And I don't want anyone to get eliminated, because I think they're also delightful.
Yeah, I am enjoying them very much so far. Although I will say, it's finally hit the, now we're going to do the same challenge with a twist part of the life of the series. I was like, oh, mini rolls, seen that. Oh, anti-gravity cake, seen that. So it's all just variations on a theme now.
But still somehow really satisfying.
So fun to watch.
So everyone check out this hot new show, Great British Bake Off. Everyone, welcome to the podcast. It chooses you. I'm Claire Patton.
And I'm Teresa Sparks. Claire tells me stories. I tell her stories.
We both tell you stories.
There it is. Please like it, subscribe to it, and download it. And if you really like it, you can Patreon it. It's Patreon/It Chooses You, and our patrons help us keep the podcast ad-free, which is very important to us.
Teresa, I'm very excited because today we're going to talk about guerrilla gardening.
Yay! You mentioned that you were going to do this. This is very exciting.
So guerrilla gardening is the act of a community claiming space that is abandoned or neglected by gardening there. Obviously, they're taking a military word, guerrilla, and applying it to something that is the opposite of death, life.
Yeah.
Which is one of my favorite things about it. It's well branded, the guerrilla gardening.
Yeah. It's also got that very nice alliteration. You don't see a double G very often.
Guerrilla gardening is a form of activism and community building. It tends to occur, of course, in urban areas. And it's also usually illegal. The term emerged in the 1970s with the work of two women in New York City named Hattie Carthan and Liz Christie. And we'll get to Liz in just a minute, but first I want to tell you about Hattie Carthan. In the 1960s, Hattie, who lived in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn, which was a red line district, organized her community to plant trees, raising money and organizing volunteers. Under her leadership, block associations planted more than 1,500 trees in less than 10 years. They planted sycamores, ginkgo trees, and honey locusts, to name just a few.
Nice.
Obviously, trees bring shade. Trees reduce the cost of cooling and heating a home. Trees clean the air and water and reduce the chances of flooding in an area. A study has shown that when someone is considering buying a home, the presence of trees can make that potential buyer value the home up to 11% over its actual value.
Mm-hmm.
Neighborhoods with trees are considered nicer, quote unquote, and more expensive neighborhoods to live in. Not surprisingly, underserved areas tend to have fewer trees.
Right. If you're in a red line district, chances are, therefore, you will not have trees.
On average, the temperature in red line neighborhoods are 2.6 degrees warmer than in other areas.
I mean, it's just another example of white supremacy and oppression. It's like one of the 1,000 ways that we as white people, as a group, have made things harder and less pleasant for people we oppress. Even your neighborhood is going to be slightly hotter than ours. Even you're going to have less shade than we do. That's another thing we'll take from you.
It's just flabbergasting. In 1968, New York City was going to demolish 4 abandoned brownstones. You have to realize at this point, the real estate market was not what it is now in New York City. There were a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of empty lots, and a lot of communities saw an opportunity to create green spaces. New York City was going to destroy these brownstones, and the problem for Hattie was that there was a large magnolia tree along these buildings that had been planted in 1885. It was a Magnolia grandiflora, which is very common in the South, but less common in the North. So not only was it this gorgeous, huge tree that had been there for almost 100 years, it had beaten the odds. Hattie started a campaign and was able to save the historic magnolia tree by convincing the city to sell her those brownstones for $1,200, all 4 brownstones.
Wow.
The city declared the tree a living landmark, which I think we should just have everywhere.
Yes.
A living landmark means it could not be destroyed. It would remain protected from then on out. In those brownstones, the Magnolia Tree Earth Center was established by Hattie, which is dedicated to the study of nature and how it can improve neighborhoods. They also have a big initiative for educating children about gardening and caring for trees. Hattie founded the center at the age of 72.
Nice.
I should mention that her campaign to plant more trees started when she was in her 60s.
It's awesome.
I will be drooling myself at 72, I'm sure of it. So there's also a community garden, an urban farm, and a farmer's market in Bed-Stuy that bear her name. The magnolia tree still stands at 677 Lafayette Avenue in New York.
Nice.
Now, around the same time, in 1962, Luis Torres and his neighbor, Jose Ayala, cleaned up an abandoned lot, and they created a community garden and a hangout space in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They called it El Jardín de Paraíso, the Garden of Paradise. This garden also still stands today. The history of guerrilla gardening is a little bit difficult to trace because there was this opportunity, as I said, with all these abandoned lots and abandoned buildings, and it just started happening.
Mm-hmm.
Who was the first person to have the idea? Who knows? But it was the right time, the right place, and people just rose up and started doing this.
They're like, oh, that's a great idea. We can do that. There's an abandoned lot down the block. Perfect.
And there's also that synchronicity of thought where a bunch of people in the same place start doing the same thing. These community gardens, this guerrilla gardening was the result of communities looking for ways to sustain themselves and create healthy spaces to be and to grow food. In the 1970s in New York, a woman named Liz Christie co-founded a group called the Green Guerrillas, which is where the term guerrilla gardening probably comes from. I want to make a note here, which is that a couple of sources I saw said that Hattie Carthan was also a co-founder of that group, but the Green Guerrillas are still in existence today, and their own website doesn't specifically mention her. So I'm not sure if it's a case of whitewashing, or I would imagine at the very least they knew each other and Hattie inspired Liz for sure, being in those similar circles.
Liz is a white woman, I take it?
Yes. Green Guerrillas focused on revitalizing abandoned areas. One of their tactics was to throw seed bombs.
Yeah, the best kind.
I love seed bombs. For anyone who doesn't know, a seed bomb is a cluster of seeds that you sort of pack into a ball with earth around it and sometimes fertilizer and things like that. And then the idea is you throw the ball over a fence into an abandoned lot. The ball disintegrates over time, the seeds are planted, and then something beautiful grows there. I find it such a wonderful idea, and the best antidote to the darkness that we're confronted with sometimes is to plant a little life.
Yeah, and it's so random. It's like what germinates. We don't know. It's just a little ball of hope. And let's hope that this thing turns into something beautiful. All the ingredients are there. Fingers crossed. Let's do it.
Exactly. And it's not precious.
Yeah, that's right. That's actually the best part.
As I said, Green Guerrillas would throw seed bombs over fences into disused lots. They would also plant flowers in medians and created flower boxes outside the windows of abandoned buildings.
Nice.
They started a community garden at an abandoned lot at the corner of Bowery and Houston. Amos Taylor, an early member of Green Guerrillas, called it a form of civil disobedience.
I mean, they're technically breaking the law, right?
They are.
That's private property.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't make it pretty.
The community garden they established eventually became the first city-approved community garden and is still operating today. It's now called the Liz Christie Bowery Houston Garden. The Magnolia Tree Earth Center and Green Guerrillas are both still operating. There are over 600 community gardens currently in New York City, certainly thanks to the legacy of these early guerrilla gardeners. So now I've just told you a couple of instances of successful guerrilla gardeners, but it doesn't always go that well when the quote-unquote owners of some land and their communities clash. I'm now going to tell you the story of People's Park in Berkeley, an area that the community has been fighting for since the 60s and is still fighting for today. In 1967, the regents of UC Berkeley decided to buy 2.8 acres of land, which was at the time occupied by a neighborhood. I should note this land was bought through eminent domain, or as I call it, the devil's real estate.
That's right.
Eminent domain is where they can just force homeowners and residents to leave.
We want it. It's better for everyone if you leave.
We're richer.
We're richer and whiter. Get out.
The houses were demolished, but the land was left undeveloped, as the university didn't have the money to follow through with their plan at the time.
They forced people out of their homes to create an empty lot.
Yep.
Awesome.
This was an empty lot. It was left alone. And eventually local residents and business owners came together without the university's permission or presence and decided to turn the area into a public park. So they just basically got together and were like, what should we do with this? Let's turn it into a park. Okay. So they did that. On Sunday, April 20th, 1969, over 100 people showed up to build the park. Money and materials were donated from across the community.
Love it.
And the group named it People's Park.
Mm-hmm.
This was at the end of April, and by mid-May, the park was just about complete. However, before then, at the end of April, the vice chancellor of the university announced his plan to build a sports field in the area. He said he wouldn't make a move without notifying park activists.
Is he going to keep his word?
They're going to try. On May 13th, the chancellor of the university announced that they would begin construction on the site, but again, he said he'd work with the community before making any moves. People, many of them students, started protesting at the park against this development of the area. On May 15th, just 2 days later after this announcement, then Governor Ronald Reagan, who had run on the promise to crack down on these student demonstrations, decided to make an example of them. He sent the Highway Patrol and Berkeley Police to the scene. An 8-foot-high fence was erected to keep people from continuing work on the park. This is still on May 15th. 3,000 people showed up for an unrelated rally around noon that Thursday, and the group at some point moved towards the park. Someone in the group said, "Let's take the park." He later said, "I really didn't mean to start all of this, but it happened." They moved towards the park. Things were thrown, tear gas was dispensed, of course, and more police were sent to the scene. Eventually, 791 officers arrived.
Oh my God.
Officers were allowed off the leash. They dispersed the crowd by, quote-unquote, any means necessary. They obscured their badges, headed into the crowd, batons swinging.
Yep.
The protesters at one point retreated, and the police pursued, firing tear gas and 00 buckshot into the crowd. At first, the police denied the use of 00 buckshot until medical personnel removed it from the bodies of victims as proof. James Rector, who was sitting on the roof of a nearby building with friends watching the events unfold, was shot and killed.
My God.
Alan Blanchard, a local carpenter, was permanently blinded by taking birdshot to the face. 128 residents were hospitalized for injuries. And keep in mind, those are the ones that actually went to the hospital.
Right.
There's speculation that, of course, there are many more that feared arrest and did not seek medical assistance.
People who want to beatify Ronald Reagan, like, if you want to know what fascism looks like, it's firing into a crowd of protesters who are just existing in a park. That's a problem, America.
Medical students created mobile medical units to treat some of the wounded. A local hospital reported that 2 students were wounded by large caliber rifles.
Oh my God.
I mean, what the fuck? That evening, Reagan sent in the National Guard, even though Berkeley's city council voted against the decision. The National Guard patrolled the streets of Berkeley for weeks, breaking up demonstrations. Reagan said, quote, "Once the dogs of war have been unleashed, you must expect things will happen, and that people, being human, will make mistakes on both sides."
Fuck that guy.
What a piece.
It's yet another example of how the National Guard is the interior police force of the federal government, not accountable to any local authority. And we will talk about that in a future episode when I tell you about the mine wars.
Demonstrations continued for several days. 177 UC Berkeley faculty members refused to teach until the violence and the occupation ended. On May 23rd, the University Senate decided to accept a proposal from the College of Environmental Design to allow the park to be part of an experiment in community-generated design. But the university regents decided to continue with their plans to build on-site. On May 30th, 30,000 citizens of Berkeley, out of a city of 100,000 at the time, 30,000 citizens marched peacefully to protest Reagan's actions, the presence of the National Guard in their city, the death of James Rector, and the other acts of violence that had taken place in Berkeley. A plane flew over Berkeley at the time with a banner that said, "Let 1,000 parks bloom." And that's the thing that gets me, is this is about a green space for the community. How could that be controversial?
Yeah.
This is about a park. The National Guard presence remained in the city, as I said, for the next few weeks, and arrests continued. The university continued with their plans, leaving the perimeter fence in place, and another protest occurred in 1971, so a couple of years later. In May of 1972, a crowd tore down the fence, and finally, in September of that year, the Berkeley City Council voted to lease the land from the university in order to keep the park. The park was rebuilt, again with volunteers and donations from the community. There was another dispute in 1979 when the university decided to tear down a community stage at the west end of the park to erect a parking lot for the students and faculty. There were more protests at that time, but the university finally gave in, and the area became a community garden. They were added again in 1991, with the university announcing redevelopment of the park in an effort to construct sand volleyball courts.
Of all the frivolous bullshit. Now this is a historic park. It has a lot of American history tied up with it. And you're just going to take part of it for sand volleyball courts? Get your head on straight.
Yeah. Of course, in response to this, demonstrations began again, and of course, there were more injuries caused by the police. In 2011, the university bulldozed that community garden on the west side, and they also bulldozed some mature trees at the west end of the park to provide, quote, safer, more sanitary conditions. It's for your own good.
What the safer?
We're trying to help you. I should note here that there's a lot of homeless activity in the area, so that is a huge part of the motivation, I'm sure.
Sure, but if you don't have a house, the least we can do is let you sleep in the park. I mean, that's my opinion.
This bulldozing of the community garden was, as I said, in 2011. They did it during the winter break, so there wouldn't really be anyone there to protest or cause a stink. In 2018, the university announced another development project for People's Park, including housing for students, supportive housing for veterans and the city's homeless population, and a memorial to the park's history. Right? So they're trying to, what'll make them happy? What'll shut them up? Right?
We'll put a plaque on the wall of the building.
Yep. In January of this year, 2021, the university actually began taking action on this latest development plan. There were a number of people living in tents in the area who had lost housing on account of COVID, and they were forcibly removed by the police. Fences were once again placed around the park to keep people out. A rally was held, the fences were removed and left on the steps of the university's admin building.
Nice.
Here's your fucking fence.
Take your fence back.
You left it over there in our area.
We'll fence you into your office.
Yeah. A community group called Defend People's Park was established, and they began a 24-hour occupation of the park. They have a list of demands, including a halt on the development and more transparency from the university. The group has noted that the affordable housing that's to serve the very poor and underserved of the community will cost residents about $1,400 a month. That's not affordable housing, people.
$1,400 a month. Like this, the idea, like, do people who make these plans not know what the minimum wage is? Do they not know, if not minimum wage, what the average wage is that people earn in their area? I mean, multiply it by 40, multiply it by 4, take out 20% for taxes. Is that $1,400 a month? No, it is not. Not for most people. Ugh.
The occupation of People's Park is continuing right now. It's happening right this minute.
Oh my God.
And we'll keep you posted if there are any significant developments. But you can follow Defend People's Park on Twitter if you'd like to stay in the loop.
That's awesome.
Like, what is up with that area? I mean, it's really what is up with that university. But the single piece of land has been controversial for decades now, for half a century.
So it's historical because it was controversial in its beginnings. And so if the university says, okay, it's going to be this kind of park from now on, they basically have a 45-year investment. I'm sure some asshole on some university committee talks about it in these terms. This is a 45-year investment that we're going to lose a bunch of money on just because some hippies think that trees are nice. I mean, I'm imagining this is the argument, right? And they can dress it up and they can use different language than that. But ultimately, I think that's a correct representation of the kernel of the argument. I'm appalled that a university, like an organization that exists to educate, would ignore the incredible opportunity that this piece of land represents to them in terms of modern American history. Like, that blows my mind more than anything else you've talked about.
Yeah. And one piece that I didn't follow up on, I didn't find any additional information on, is what happened with that lease, right? The city was leasing the land to keep it public land. So I'm assuming that that lease is over if the university is trying to redevelop, right? But I'm not 100% sure on what's going on there.
I mean, people who are chancellors of universities, I think we can say across the board, are just not great people. Like, I've never heard of a chancellor doing the right thing. I've heard of them being pressured into doing the right thing after a huge amount of protest and organization and legal action. Maybe that's something we can look into. Has there ever been a decent university chancellor?
There's an episode for you.
I'll accept that challenge. I'll see if I can find one.
Teresa, this next story is a little bit different. It doesn't center around gardening specifically, but it is about a community reclaiming land, which to me is what guerrilla gardening is at its core.
All right.
This story I found on an episode of 99% Invisible, the podcast. The episode's called He's Still Neutral. This episode was created by the podcast Criminal, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. Dan Stevenson and his wife Lou have lived in a 2-story Victorian house in a neighborhood called Eastlake in Oakland, California for the past 40-something years. Crime had been an issue in Eastlake. Dan's approach to life was to stay out of the way of his neighbor's business. So he had a very live and let live approach to being a neighbor. And so he didn't mess with his neighbors didn't mess with him. He was pretty happy living there. He never called the police on people because he doesn't trust the police. He says they have no common sense and they jump to very militaristic tactics, which he's not into. He's like, they never address the situation the way they should.
Yes, they should de-escalate. Basically, I think the police should be therapists on call. Hey, everybody, how you doing? They should also be trained just in case there is just some crazy dude with a gun, right? We'll need a response to that. But for the most part, their role should be to make things better, not crack down.
Right. So to give you an idea of what kind of guy Dan is, in around 2010, at 3 a.m., he and his wife were awakened in the night by someone on their deck. Now, their deck required you to climb up a tree and over a railing to get on it. So the person out there had really committed. So Dan went out there and confronted this man who was on his deck. He said the guy was just messed up. His wife, Lou, wanted him to call the police, but Dan's opinion was the guy was just out of it. Let's be calm about this. So he talked to the guy for 45 minutes until he finally got him off the porch. This is the kind of guy he was, right?
Yeah.
Things are not other people's problems. And he said, hey, look, I went right back to bed. He said, if I had called the cops, the situation could have escalated. I certainly would have been awake for the next 2 hours filing reports with them about this. So this is the kind of guy Dan was. What Dan couldn't stand was a pile of garbage on the concrete divide across the street. There was a median, a divider in the middle of the street that kind of was planted with grass. And for whatever reason, people would just pile garbage there. There were trees, but the area became a local garbage dump over the years. People left furniture there, mattresses, bags of garbage, and clothing. And this drove Dan absolutely insane. Trucks would pull up at night and dump refuse. Dan says it was a little bit like a magnet. If the area had been cleared, once one thing appeared, then more would appear. And he said that sometimes the stacks could get 6 to 8 feet high. Dan and his wife, who I should state right now are not Buddhist, had the idea to put a Buddha on the divider. What if we put a Buddha here? What would happen? Would it change anything? Dan says that the reason why they chose Buddha was because most people feel neutral about Buddha. He said if we had put Christ on a cross, there would have been some serious emotional reaction. But Buddha, everybody's cool with Buddha. Lou picked a Buddha up made of concrete at Ace Hardware, and Dan put it in the median. Now, he was a little worried it might be stolen, so he drilled into the statue and put rebar and epoxy to secure it to the ground. He didn't ask permission. He decided to act and just see what would happen. Buddha sat there calmly for about 4 months until one morning Dan woke up and Buddha was painted a soft white. He said, examining the paint job, it was very careful and intentional. Then one morning, Buddha was sitting there with an orange. One morning, a pear. Then 2 oranges. Then a coin, for example. Dan didn't know who was bringing the gifts for a time, but eventually he realized that the local Vietnamese community had begun to care for the Buddha and the land around it. Nowadays, years later, Buddha is gold. His eyes are painted. He has a gold drape and sits on a granite pedestal within a small temple. There are several other Buddha statues as well. The Vietnamese community comes every morning to pray at the temple, and sometimes they feast there. There are actually lots of Buddha statues, several shrines. They're covered in blinking lights, incense fills the air, and now there's another shrine about 1.5 blocks away as well. Vina Vo and her husband are leading the charge in caring for the Oakland Buddha, as it's come to be named. They credit Dan with the peaceful Buddhist shrine, but taking care of the area has become a community effort. The community knows Dan is the man who brought the Buddha. Sometimes they bring Dan gifts on occasion, but he seems a little overwhelmed by it. He feels it's their Buddha, not his. Tourist buses have started to come by and visit the area, and sometimes they come to his door and are like, "Are you the guy?" In these intervening years, crime has gone down in Dan's neighborhood by about 82%. The podcast kind of makes a big deal about this, and my question would be, okay, but was the area becoming gentrified anyway? It's a little bit of a tricky issue. You can argue that Dan's actions are a form of hostile architecture. Hostile architecture is when people, usually people in power, try to alter the ways the community uses an area. Examples would be urine deflectors or paint that repels urine back onto the urinator, benches that are uncomfortable to sit or sleep on, windowsills that are tilted at odd angles. These are alterations to space that typically aim at discouraging homeless populations and the youth from occupying an area. At its core, hostile architecture changes the way a community uses space. This story is certainly the story of a man changing the way a community uses space. For me, Dan is changing the intention of the space by placing a Buddha there. But I don't think it's hostile architecture because the community decided what to do with the space, and the community embraced the intention and ran with it. Dan is very clear that he did this first thing and that's it. This isn't mine anymore.
I think there's a clue in the name. I mean, hostile architecture is architecture that aims to make space less comfortable to inhabit, it seems to me. All of those examples you gave are that. But placing a Buddha where people are dumping trash, and that simple, the visual comparison of a Buddha and a trash and furniture pile leading the community to say, oh, yeah, we could make a different choice here. He didn't make it less comfortable. He made it prettier. He didn't stop people from dumping trash there. I'm sure they still did. But over time, the community's like, oh, here's a different choice we could make, and then chose differently. I find that really interesting.
Obviously, the tradition of guerrilla gardening continues today. There are a number of groups working all over the world to green urban spaces. May 1st, everyone mark your calendars, is International Sunflower Guerrilla Gardening Day, in which guerrilla gardeners all over the world plant sunflower seeds in neglected areas. There's a group called Guerrilla Grafters. They're based out of San Francisco, and their deal is they graft fruit branches onto ornamental trees. It struck me that some people might not know about this, but one amazing thing about trees is that you can take a fruit-bearing branch of, say, an apple or pear tree, and you can cut it and graft it onto another tree, and that then one branch will bear fruit. So that's their deal. As innocuous as this sounds, this is technically illegal. Mm-hmm. And the city claims that they're worried about the mess caused by falling fruit and attracting animals. I love that attracting animals is like this horrible end game. It'll be the Thunderdome out there.
Next thing you know, there'll be raccoons everywhere. And as we know, raccoons are very, very tough.
There's a man called Ron Finley who's operating as a guerrilla gardener in South Central LA. Ron became a guerrilla gardener as a response to his neighborhood being a food desert. He saw the effects of bad food on his community, and he decided to do something about it. He tells his story in a TED Talk that he gave back in 2013. I'd encourage everyone to watch it because his story is very compelling. But I would like to finish today with his words. Gardening is my graffiti. I grow my art, just like a graffiti artist, where they beautify walls, I beautify lawns, parkways. I use the garden, the soil, like it's a piece of cloth, and the plants and the trees, that's my embellishment for that cloth. He later says, gardening is the most therapeutic and defiant act you can do, especially in the inner city. Plus, you get strawberries. Mm-hmm. So that's Ron Finley. He's delightful. Check him out at ronfinley.com. It's Ron, R-O-N, Finley, Finley.com. He's got a donate button and he sells some really fun swag. So go support him. On a personal note, I used to live in a town. I used to live in Boulder, which I guess is technically a city, but now I've moved out to the country. Having told these stories, I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm a white woman living on a good amount of property that belongs to the Arapaho, Pawnee, Comanche, and Cheyenne people, not to me. I moved out here for many reasons, but one of them is that I gave up on some of the ideals that I admire so much in guerrilla gardeners. My home in the city was in a trailer park, and we had a garden in our yard where I learned to become a gardener. That small garden space was so important to me, and the management of the trailer park was always threatening to outlaw vegetable gardens. Gardens have always seemed magic to me, and it didn't make sense. Who would object to a garden? The villains, that's who.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
If you're wondering whether you're the bad guy, and you've just bulldozed a tree or tore up a garden, the answer is yes, you are the bad guy.
Yep.
Outlawing gardens never happened while I lived in that trailer park, But the sense of betrayal, anger, and insecurity that I felt when those threats were wielded was real.
Mm-hmm.
I craved a space where no one could take my garden from me, and now I'm here, living in the country, on land that is not, never was, and never will be mine. These stories are conflicts between the people who, quote-unquote, own the land and the people who steward it. When you care for something, you don't own it, you belong to it. Our relationship to land, to the space around us, is the flashpoint for rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
Food justice is social justice, and the people we've discussed in this episode are no less than revolutionaries. So let's support them in any way we can. Let's release the desire for a piece of land to belong to us and aspire instead to one day belong to the land.
Yes!
I mentioned a common tactic of guerrilla gardeners is to make seed bombs. If you're interested in making your own, check us out at patreon.com/itchoosesYou for a recipe just for you. There you can also find an extensive list of sources for this episode and connect with some of these groups I've mentioned if you're interested in getting involved in guerrilla gardening yourself.
Yay. Thank you, Claire. That was awesome.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Testing? Great. Thank you for listening to It Chooses You. Your hosts are Teresa Sparks and Claire Patton. Our theme song is by Bobby Dart. If you'd like to get in touch with us, drop us an email at itchoosesyouPodcast@gmail.com.